This is the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria, session number 21.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everyone, it's Matt Sikoria, and we are at session 21 of the Behavioral Observations Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am really thrilled to welcome Gina Green to the program. Dr. Gina Green is the Chief Executive Officer of the Association for Professional Behavior Analysts. And in today's episode, we talk about the APBA, its unique role as it relates to our practice. And we also talk a lot about the licensure of our practice in the various states and some of the lessons that have been learned and best practices and things like that. Again, as it relates to issues of legislation, licensure, and things along those lines. And beyond that, it's really hard to introduce Gina. The reason I say that is because she's had such a long and illustrious career and has won so many awards and had so many, esteemed positions in her field, including things like I just said, being the CEO of APBA, being the president of ABAI, and I can go on and on and on and on and on. But I think what I'll do is post her bio at behavioralobservations.com session 21. So for anyone who needs more information about her background, I mean, of course, she does go into that quite a bit at the beginning of this conversation, but the conversation itself is it's almost 2 hours in length, so I'm going to try to keep this introductory section brief. So if you want more information, go to behavioralobservations.com session 21, and you can check it out there. Now, in our conversation, I do get a chance to ask some of your questions. I can't do a full Q&A episode like I did the last time with Greg Hanley for every episode, but I am going to start soliciting questions from people who are subscribed to my email list ahead of interviews. So I had a chance to try that out here with Gina's interview, and a lot of you rose to the challenge and sent in great questions. I did not get a chance to ask them all, however, because our conversation was limited to APBA and licensure. We didn't get into some of the stuff that I wanted to kind of continue the conversation with, i.e. things like skepticism, pseudoscience, evidence-based practices, and things like that. Time just did not permit that. Hopefully we'll have a part 2 with Gina in the near future where we can get into those things in a little bit more detail. But so if you want to get in on that, go to behavioralobservations.com, and on the homepage you'll see a big red button on the right that you can just click on and follow the prompts, and I will send an email to you before I interview someone asking for questions. Finally, before we get into the conversation, I did want to let you know that we now have transcripts available and some continuing education opportunities. So head on over to behavioralobservations.com/membership, and you can check out all the details there. So I won't belabor the point. Again, this is a long conversation, so I want to get to it as soon as possible. We did have a few technical glitches, so it becomes pretty apparent at a certain point where those glitches took place. I'm going to beg your forgiveness in advance here and ask you to bear with us, because I think the content that Gina brings to the show is excellent. So without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Gina Green to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. Dr. Gina Green, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
And you're coming to us from what is now rainy, I was going to say sunny Southern California, but it's now rainy. It is the middle of January here in northern New England, so I think the listeners can probably fill in the blanks and guess what the weather is like on my end. But I am more than honored to have you here on the podcast. You have been someone that people have emailed me repeatedly saying, please have Gina Green on. I sent an email out to my email list asking for questions, and I got a lot of responses back. People want to ask you all sorts of questions about evidence-based practices and early intervention and insurance and things like that. And so, long story short, it's just a treat to have you on here. So again,
Thank you.
welcome to the show.
I'm honored by the invitation and also by the interest that your listeners have demonstrated. Well, I hope we can live up to the expectations.
All right. Yes, that's right. Now that we said all that,
Yeah.
so one of the reasons I wanted to chat with you is I'm going to APBA, and you put out a kind of a really clarion call about the importance of APBA not too long ago, and also talked about how attending the conference is one of the best ways to support it. So I want to talk about the role of the APBA, your role in it, talk about the conference itself, et cetera, et cetera. However, as I like to begin every show with, I want to talk about how people got into behavior analysis. So I was wondering if you can start by sharing how you first encountered behavior analysis and kind of trace that to where we are right now. So what was your first was it the class? How did you come into the field?
Well, I'll try to make it as short a story as possible. I grew up in a really small village in southern Michigan, but I was lucky enough to have a psychology class in high school. This was a long time ago, so it was really uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a great teacher, got interested in behavior, went to Michigan State University as a psychology major. And in I think it was my very first class, it was an honors class, Introduction to Psychology. It's one of those typical sort of surveys of psychology. So I date myself here, 1969. And in that class, we had, of course, a little smattering of what was then called operant conditioning and Skinner. And I remember very clearly still the doctoral student who taught that section showing the video of Lobos's work in language with autistic children, developing language. I think it was called operant conditioning of language in children with autism. And I was just kind of fascinated by that right away. But it was 1969. It was Vietnam. It was, protests and anti-establishment and anti-control. That was the social context. So, I had that interest. I took some other classes. I had a really good learning class at Michigan State. I had a year-long practicum with Hiram Fitzgerald, who did some of the very early work on classical conditioning with infants, mm-hmm. and applying some information from learning to childcare. So I had this little, kind of bits and pieces of things, and I kept being more drawn to that work, the conditioning and learning work, than to what the majority of my program was at my undergraduate program, which was really clinical, sort of at the time, child-centered play therapy.
So was behaviorism or whatever it was referred to at the operant conditioning, was that seen as kind of square amongst the backdrop that you had painted earlier of this kind of?
I think there was a general tendency, for people to be more drawn to the, things. There's that aspect of control, and I think that whole notion of generalized notion about control was not popular, in the 1960s and in general. And at the same time, though, that was really obviously the very early days of the development of behavior analysis. And there were clearly lots of people doing, very good basic research, the beginnings of applied research and in operant conditioning and classical conditioning as well. So, it's not like I was discouraged from being interested. It's just most of my classmates, I'd say, were not as excited about it as I might have been. Mm-hmm. But what I always have considered a kind of epiphany is that I had this class in, again, a year-long honors practicum in child clinical psychology. And it was all about child-centered, non-directive, Carl Rogers type play therapy. And there was a clinic at Michigan State where they did evaluations of kids with autism. And I had a friend who was a graduate student in psychology. She worked in that clinic, so I would talk to her, and I just got kind of interested in autism. And I'll never forget a day in that practicum class when I had to go into this humongous playroom there in the clinic, and there's toys all over the place. My professor and classmates are watching from an observation room. And I walked into this room, and here's a little girl who is toe walking, spinning around, kind of rambling all over this giant room, flapping her hands, screeching. She was a child who'd been diagnosed with autism. And I just remember thinking, the client-centered play therapy I'd been taught, would have suggested that what I was supposed to do is say, oh, I see you're flapping and I hear you're screeching, reflecting back. And it just struck me that those procedures didn't have much of a chance of helping this child. And I didn't really know much about what would work, but I had an inkling. I went on and got a master's degree in what was then a school psychology program, actually, at Michigan State. And that was very much sort of applications of what was called behavior management in classrooms, also lots of assessment. And I just, again, was drawn to what I was learning that was very systematic and was data-based, and we had a lot on, remember, task analyses and developing objectives, breaking, skills down. And I took a lot of that information, the skills I developed in that master's program, and I worked on a curriculum project at Michigan State. It was actually to develop a very big curriculum for teaching motor and leisure skills to students, school-age students, who were then classified as having mental retardation, although we also branched out to kids with autism. In this project, the curriculum was, again, very behavioral. We took motor and leisure skills, broke them down into components and chains, developed activities for teaching those skills in one-to-one or small group formats, trained teachers how to do that, recorded direct observational data on how kids performed, used that information to, revise the curriculum materials, and we field tested it in special education programs in Michigan and in several other parts of the country. In the course of working on that project and traveling around, training people on it, collecting data and so on, I got to know some people who actually were trained in behavior analysis, had graduate degrees in behavior analysis. And again, just was drawn to that and was more and more interested as I talked to them. As I recall, looking back over all these years, I don't think anybody used the phrase behavior analysis in the classes that I had and the practicum experiences I had in my bachelor's and master's programs. It was always operant conditioning or, something under the guise of learning theory. But I came to learn that it was behavior analysis that people were talking about. And so after working 5 years post-master's degree on this curriculum project at Michigan State, I figured out what I wanted to be when I grew up was a behavior analyst. And so I decided to pursue a PhD in behavior analysis, applied to several places, ultimately went to Utah State University, because at that time, they had a really strong doctoral program in the analysis of behavior. And the main reason I initially chose Utah State is that there was a day school on the campus that provided education services to about 100 children with autism and other diagnoses from local school districts. And it was a behavior analytic program. In 1980, they were doing pretty much intensive ABA, at least during the 6 hours a day or so that the kids were at the school. And the director of that program was Seb Streifeld, who was a Kansas-trained doctoral level behavior analyst. I just wanted to learn how to do applied behavior analysis with kids with autism. Mm-hmm. And once I got there to Utah State and started the coursework and lab work and things, I got very interested in the experimental analysis of behavior. So I pretty much for my entire doctoral program and for quite a while after that, I kind of had one foot in experimental analysis and one foot in applied behavior analysis.
Do you think that's possible to do these days with the depth and breadth of how those two branches, if you will, of behaviorism have unfolded?
Well, that's a really good question. I think there are some people who are managing to do that. It's been a while, since I was fully immersed in an academic situation. I mean, I've taught at universities off and on, though not for a while, but it seems to me to be really challenging just because, as you suggested there, the amount of information in both branches, not to mention the conceptual part of the discipline, which is essential. Mm-hmm. Whether you're going to do applied or experimental work, you got to have the concepts and principles. And I don't know, I think that even in an intensive and rigorous doctoral program, it'd be pretty hard to cover substantial amounts of material in all three of those areas. I'm sure there are people who are succeeding in doing it. Don't know if I could, today.
Well, yeah, it is notable though, because I was looking through your publications, and I didn't break it down into how many in each, but certainly it's notable for many publications in the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior, as well as Java and other applied publications as well. So it's just pretty cool to have those perspectives in both domains. Well,
I feel really fortunate to have gotten such great training at Utah State in all of those branches, experimental, conceptual, and applied behavior analysis, along with just great practical training at what was then called the Exceptional Child Center at Utah State University.
Pretty cool. So can you kind of, trace from where you were at that point? So you're finishing up your PhD at Utah, and so how do you get from there to being the executive director of the APBA? And can you do it in 30 seconds? I'm just kidding. Plenty of time here.
My first job out of my doctoral program was teaching in the master's program in behavior analysis and therapy at Southern Illinois University. I was pretty much groomed, I feel, for an academic position by my faculty mentors at Utah State. And I spent 3 years at SIU, had great experience, had some great colleagues and students there. In my doctoral program, I'd gotten really interested in stimulus control and specifically in stimulus equivalence, which, again, it's just beginning to be, an area of substantial interest and research in behavior analysis when I was a doctoral student. And so while I was at Southern Illinois, I'd gotten to know, starting in graduate school and throughout the time I was at SIU, I'd gotten to know other folks who were doing research in stimulus equivalence and related topics at University of Kansas, and notably at the E.K. Schreiber Center in Boston. And I had an opportunity to go to work at the Schreiber Center on in the great stimulus control research program that Murray Sidman had started years before that. And Murray he was retired from teaching at Northeastern University, but he was still very active in the research at the Schreiber Center. So I just felt like, I really loved research, and I didn't feel, it was a struggle to do as much research as I wanted to do at Southern Illinois University, simply because I had a lot of classes to teach and, student practica to supervise and so on. Did manage to get a good research group in stimulus equivalence going there, and we got several nice publications. But I just felt like I wanted to at least try focusing entirely on research, and I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to go work with Murray Sidman and Larry Stoddard and Bill McElvain and Bill Doobie and Bob Stromer and, these great stimulus control researchers at the Schreiber Center.
Sure, yeah, what an opportunity.
Yeah, so I actually took a leave of absence from SIU, moved to Boston to see how things went for a year. Once I was there, I decided to stay, and so I resigned formally from SIU. And the E.K. Schreiber Center, is a developmental disabilities research institute, and the stimulus control research was done, out in applied programs. So they had learning labs set up in these programs in the area that served school-age students, mostly with autism and other developmental disabilities. And one of those was called the New England Center for Autism. So because I had an interest in autism, I kind of became the liaison between the Schreiber Center and the New England Center. And so I would, oversee the research that was being done at the New England Center. After a little while, the executive director there asked me if I would serve part-time. I think I started one day a week as the director of research at the New England Center to help build the applied research program there. And I said yes. And just long story short is over time, I became the full-time director of research at the New England Center for Children, now it's called.
Sure, or NACA, as it were, right?
Yeah, but I kept my appointment with the Schreiber Center. I continued to have research grants through the Schreiber Center. And so again, a lot of that work was done in our learning labs and classrooms at the New England Center for Children. I was there altogether in the Boston area, those two programs for 12 years before moving to San Diego. Now, 15 years ago, it was actually not long after 9/11. Moved here, and that was really to pursue a job offer to help an applied program in this area develop an APBA program and some applied research. It didn't hurt that I had been doing some consulting in San Diego. I had some good, very close friends who had moved from Boston out to San Diego ahead of me, and I would visit them and do this consulting, and couldn't help notice that people were really friendly, smiling. Why not? The weather was fantastic. It's, just a great area of a lot of geographic and cultural diversity. And I thought, when I got the job offer, well, I'd grown up in the Midwest. I'd lived there for a lot of years, lived in the Rocky Mountains. 6 years I was at Utah State, lived on the East Coast for 12 years. Why not try the West Coast?
You were due for some nice weather, I guess.
Well, I will say a factor was the winter weather in New England, as you know. I mean, you have so many days where it's cold and dark and, dealing with the ice and snow, damage to my house and things like that. It was getting to be a little bit trying.
Sure.
So I moved here. I worked for that program for a couple of years. They had some budget issues and decided they couldn't have a director of research after all. And so I did some consulting to autism programs and taught at San Diego State University half-time for a total of probably about 7 years. I taught one class in the graduate program, a master's program in public health, and one for the Department of Special Education that was applied behavior analysis for autism. Let's see. Then, so I had also, during, the span of that time I just described, gotten involved in organizations and the Association for Behavior Analysis, state organizations, and was getting, more and more, probably more involved in applied work than experimental than research at that time. I was fortunate enough to serve on the Behavior Analyst Certification Board in the pretty early days. It was established in 1998. I got on the board in 2000 and spent from 2000 to 2006 as a volunteer member of the board of directors of the Bcba. Learned a lot about really more about the applied side of our field, but in particular, professional credentialing programs and the importance of those and all the things that need to go along with things like a legitimate professional credentialing program to grow a profession, to help a profession, develop into a mature one. So various things sort of converged, and some colleagues and I had, for a long time, and seeing the need for work, particularly in public policies, advocating for public policies and other aspects of the practice side of our field, which was just growing by leaps and bounds in numbers as well as complexity. And for a number of reasons, we ultimately decided that there needed to be an organization that was focused entirely and exclusively on the practice side of the field. And so we founded the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts in 2007. Kind of, officially opened the doors as a standalone, independent organization in 2008. I was asked to become the part-time executive director in 2009. And of course, it was still very much a startup organization at that point. Once it got on its feet a little bit, I became full-time executive director. And just recently had my title changed to Chief Executive Officer.
Oh, okay. We're breaking news here on the podcast.
I do the same thing I've been doing.
Right, of course. That's right. We can't give you a raise, Gina, but guess what? You're now the CEO. Wow, that's pretty cool. So from your perspective, what differentiates ABAI from, I still have to catch myself from saying ABBA, but so what differentiates APBA from ABAI?
Well, I think it is in the case of APBA the focus on practice, on the professional practice of behavior analysis. Our mission is to support and advance the science-based practice of behavior analysis. And there are many ways that we do that, but a major component of the mission is advocating for public policies, for laws and regulations that affect the practice of behavior analysis. And that is where, APBA really is distinct. Again, that's not all we do. We also provide resources and education opportunities and activities, that cut across other aspects of practice. But it's really that concentration on public policy advocacy that distinguishes APBA from other organizations. We work with behavior analysis organizations within localities, states, provinces, and countries, with consumer advocates, with legislators and regulators on laws ranging from licensure and other regulation of ABA practitioners to laws that govern public and private health insurance, education, other sources of funding and support for ABA services.
Okay, so I want to dig into that a little bit, but before I get any further, and I have to change my question now because I was going to ask, what exactly is kind of like the day-to-day role of the executive director? So we'll just kind of cross out executive director and replace that with CEO. So what exactly does the CEO of the Association for Professional Behavior Analysts do?
A little bit of everything, which I imagine that's what most CEOs would say their job is. Formally, I'm responsible for working with the board of directors to develop and implement a strategic plan, and have responsibility for providing overall leadership and management to all aspects of the organization's activities. So I do a lot of the work, as I mentioned, on public policy. Have done of necessity a lot of this sort of basic administrative work, including, interfacing with our treasurer and accountant and legal services, technical services, and others, and just the basic administrative work you have to do with the nonprofit organization. Mm-hmm. Recruiting members and other support, serving as one of the spokespersons for the organization, along with the president of our board, who is elected and is volunteer. We work on, I don't do all of it, but again, we'll take the lead on, developing position statements, white papers, practice guidelines, helping to develop and collect material that we can make available to members on the resources for members part of the website. Communicating. I do, interviews with reporters and, coordinate our relationships with other professional organizations.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel? I'm sorry. Go ahead. So do you feel like your clinical skills come in handy at times, with given the what sounds like a pretty robust managerial responsibility?
Well, we're very small, so although on the verge of expanding, so it's not. So I mainly, in terms of sort of personnel management, have been responsible for managing services that we contract or purchase. So, it's our attorneys and our technical support team and our accounting services. Those are all purchase services. And I'm responsible for those. We have had a part-time administrative director. Again, have gone through an extensive strategic planning process, and as a result of that are now moving to an expanded organization chart and beginning, as resources are available, to add staff.
Okay, and you're all headquartered in San Diego?
Yes, I right now, to be honest, I work out of my home when I'm not in an airplane or an airport.
I see.
Because another part of the job is, traveling a lot, speaking at conferences, going to meetings, and so on. But we are going to acquire, a physical location, as we add staff. So I don't know about I'm certainly not applying those clinical skills on a day in, day out basis in this position. Except insofar as I try to do that with whoever I'm interacting with. I do think, though, having been a practitioner, having trained quite a few practitioners, having consulted to a lot of service delivery programs, and having done both basic and applied research, and that experience on the Bcba, I think all of that has helped prepare me for what I'm doing in this position, because all of that in conjunction with going out to state and regional behavior analysis meetings and hearing what people out on the ground are dealing with, emailing and talking with lots of practitioners, and again with policymakers, consumer advocates, I think puts me in a position to have a pretty good big view of the current status of the professional practice and some sense of where it's going, and having that background in research and so on, and writing grants and writing articles of all kinds. I think all of that has stood me in good stead when it comes to doing things like trying to convince someone to adopt a law to pay for ABA services. Reading and writing legislation and regulations, not like reading JAB and JABA. It's not like writing articles for professional journals, but it's still an arena where words matter a lot, where careful, clear language, precise language, not necessarily precise in the same sense, again, as writing research grant proposals or articles, but different level of precision, kind of precision. It's really important. So I feel like I've had a lot of good practice in various areas and development of various repertoires that are, I hope, helping what I do today.
Great. We're going to talk about laws, et cetera, in a moment. But I want to talk, before we kind of leave the broad topic of APBA, I do want to kind of talk about the conference itself this year. It's in New Orleans, and for many reasons, some of them behavior analytic in nature, and some of them cultural experiences, etc. I'm looking forward to attending, and so we have so many choices of conferences to attend these days, especially with a lot of these regional chapters kind of popping up. Even in little old New Hampshire, we just a few months ago had our second annual New Hampshire ABA conference, which is and I don't have anything to do with it other than attending, and I spoke at it very briefly, but the people who put that on, it's a class act, and it was a nice conference. And so I guess the long story short here is that there's so many things out there, even in little corners of the country and perhaps elsewhere. So my general question is, if you were talking to someone, and they have these kind of finite amount of resources to expend traveling to conferences and so forth, what makes the APBA conference special?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. we always have, we're coming up on our 7th annual convention. And I think every year our convention committee has worked hard to put together a program that will afford people access to information that they may not get at a lot of other conferences and meetings. We really try to customize the program to the needs and interests of practitioners and people who are, have other interest in the practice of behavior analysis, such as those who run agencies that provide ABA services, who are not all behavior analysts, and those people who are involved in developing laws and regulations that affect behavior analysis. So we really try to make the convention program one that is going to result in folks leaving with information they can put to use almost immediately. Mm-hmm. So we still have many of our oral presentations given by carefully selected invited speakers who are not only very knowledgeable and skilled in their particular area, but are able to take, for example, the best available research evidence and translate that into practical recommendations, things practitioners can do tomorrow to enhance their clinical practice. We also have a number of presentations having to do with the business side of ABA. I know about you, but most of the behavior analysts I know, unless perhaps they specialized in organizational behavior management, got no training in business. Yeah, and many are either sort of thrust into positions where they have to take on some business administration kind of tasks, or, they, for whatever reason, have an interest in starting their own business. That's a complicated undertaking. It's an area that really overlaps with our work in public policy, because if you're going to be operating a business, you've got to know about the many and increasing numbers of laws and regulations that affect that, the services that you're providing, as well as, again, the business operations. So we always have a number of presentations on topics like that. We we also have open submissions for symposia, research symposia, and posters, and then this year, panel discussions. And again, try to make those, the content of the program overall cover as wide a range of applications of behavior analysis as possible. We try to have a lot of content that cuts across areas of application. So they have to do with ethics and professional behavior, with training practitioners and training direct intervention and staff. Again, managing a business, collaborating with others. This year, in particular, we've always had sessions on these topics, but this year I think we have a particular emphasis on laws and regulations for a couple of reasons, just because there are more and more of them. And because we are a young profession, I think a lot of people in the field are still having to sort of come to grips with the reality that we are increasingly a regulated profession, and that you absolutely have to know about the laws and regulations that affect what you do, affect the clients that you serve and their families. So we have several presentations this year by really knowledgeable attorneys and advocates and behavior analysts on a variety of different laws and regulations.
Are there specific presentations that you're looking forward to? Or if you don't want to name names or their content areas. I mean, obviously we've talked about the law. Let's get excited about laws and regulations, folks. That but it is interesting, I guess, and I guess maybe that's just kind of like
Well, it's
an
really
unusual product of
interesting.
a learning history. But
No, it's actually I think the whole area of public policy is really interesting, and I know I'm biased because that's what I do. I also in a previous life I worked for a while as a paralegal. So, and I toyed with going to law school. So I guess
really,
I've always had kind of an interest in that. And I've worked with and work now with some just wonderful attorneys. So I think that part's exciting. And I really do look forward to that aspect of the convention. Our keynote speakers this year, though, really don't work specifically in that area. We're going to have keynote addresses by Kathleen Piazza, who, of course, is a world-renowned expert on pediatric feeding disorders. Kathleen will also do a workshop on treatment of feeding problems in children with autism. Pat Fryman will give one of his inimitable and always entertaining keynote addresses on applications of behavior analysis and just sort of typical pediatric populations.
Sure, yeah.
And a workshop on presenting effectively.
Oh, really?
Which he knows a lot about.
Oh, for sure.
Is obviously proficient in. And then the other keynote will be by Greg Hanley and his, very thoughtful, I think, approach to functional assessment analysis of problem behavior. And Greg will also do a workshop on interventions for problem behavior in kids with autism. We have several meetings at the convention. We have a meeting for our affiliates. Affiliates are organizations such as state and regional behavior analysis organizations with whom we partner a lot in public policy work in their jurisdictions and in other areas. We have a meeting for university faculty, so folks who are training the future practitioners. We have a meeting for directors and CEOs of service agencies. And I don't get to attend every one of those meetings, but if I'm not chairing or attending a meeting, our members of our board of directors are. So we get a lot of information from interactions in those meetings and just informal conversations, with people throughout the convention on, what it is people are concerned about and, what they're, again, having to deal with out there in their everyday clinical and business practices.
I see. And people can find all that information at apbahome.net, right? Is that the website?
That is correct. We actually have, there's a convention page, so if people just click on the New Orleans graphic on the home page, they'll be able to access a complete program and, read about there's many more presentations and on a really nice array of topics that I didn't get to mention, as well as the meetings. We have social activities such as a great reception that is included in convention registration. It's always a lot of fun. Poster session will be in conjunction with the reception this year. We have a luncheon with roundtable discussions led by invited speakers and other experts, and that's a popular event. So we also try to have opportunities like that for people to interact with speakers and colleagues in pretty informal ways in a really friendly atmosphere. Our convention registration and workshop fees, I think, are very reasonable, especially in comparison to some other conferences.
Yes, I will second that.
And, we try to keep them that way. It's tough, but, again, we are very sensitive to the fact that, as you said, there are lots of conferences these days. And so, we try to provide really good value for the money by having a really high quality program And based on the evaluations we've been doing, it looks like we're succeeding pretty well because, most people cite the quality of the program, the utility of the information that they have obtained at our convention, and those social and professional networking opportunities that they got at the convention.
Sure.
We have CEUs, by the way, so
Oh, yeah.
folks can get, this year we'll have a workshop that will meet the requirement for the basic Bcba supervisor training. We'll have one that meets the 3 CEU supervision requirement for supervisors. We have several that will offer ethics CEUs. I know everybody
Everyone will be queuing up for those.
included. I'm going to be trying to sneak in there to get my CEUs. It would be very embarrassing if I couldn't renew my certification.
Yeah, that would be that would be funny. Very cool. I kind of embarrassed to admit I've only been to one APBA, and I think it was the first one in Boston. But I do recall leaving that saying, "Wow, I can really apply this stuff right away." So I think that sentiment that you described earlier of having really actionable assistance for those of us who are out there practicing every day is, that was certainly my impression as well. So.
Well, thank you for saying that's great to hear. I'm glad you got that, and I think the first convention. I hope we've had. I know we've had growth in terms of size, certainly from that first convention, size of attendees, and also the just the sheer number of presentations. So I think you'll find it this year, an even richer program than at that first one.
And that's the weekend, I think, of the 25th and 26th of March. But I'll have all the details.
The 23rd through the 25th.
Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Thursday, we have a number of workshops and those meetings that I mentioned. And then the full program is Friday and Saturday.
Okay, cool. Yep. And I will post a link to apba.net and there, in particular the convention page, as well as these details at behavioralobservations.com.
It's New Orleans, which, I don't know about you, it's one of my favorite places to eat, hear music, just take in the really unique subculture that is New Orleans and southern Louisiana.
Yeah, I've never been, and we did a whole episode on all the non-clinical reasons to attend. So yeah,
that was great. We really appreciated you putting that out.
Anytime to talk about food and restaurants and fun things to do, I'm there. So the pleasure.
You're reinforcers, huh?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, very very primary, right? Very cool. So. I want to move on. As I mentioned earlier, we got a lot of questions from listeners when they heard I was going to interview you, and I'm going to kind of, many of them fell along similar themes. So with apologies to all of you guys who wrote in, I'm going to kind of ask the questions in a more generalized way because I could sit here and ask like 15 questions, and so rather than doing that, I kind of summarize them into themes. So one of them is obviously you're the kind of go-to person as it relates to licensing and regulation and things like that. And you just admitted, and this is recorded, that's a reinforcing topic. Looking at licensing laws in particular, there's been, I can't remember how many states have licensing laws on the books.
26.
26, okay. Understanding that hindsight's 2020, what mistakes, if any, have been made, or put a different way, what lessons can be learned for those other states that are perhaps going through the licensure process, or at least contemplating doing so?
Well, that's the $64 million question. Licensure itself is pretty complicated, and there are political and economic and other factors that influence licensure tend to vary somewhat from one jurisdiction to another, although there certainly are things that are common. So it really, it'd take a while to answer that question, I think, thoroughly. You won't be surprised that I do, presentations on that very topic, pretty frequently. But I'll just say that, we've worked on licensure laws and the rules and regulations for implementing them now in, many different locations. So we've learned a lot about the problems that can occur, and it can very easily backfire on behavior analysts for, any number of reasons.
What are some ways in which that happens?
Well, the legislative process is, by definition, political. So, and licensure tends to be a pretty big deal to a state government. And so, you may, and we always work really hard with the behavior analysis organization in that jurisdiction because we think they should really take the lead, with a lot of support in a licensure initiative. We work really hard to try to make sure that a licensure bill is well written, has the best, clearest language, the requirements that we recommend in it, because it is invariably going to be amended as it goes through the legislative process, if it even gets very far. I mean, most bills don't succeed. They aren't adopted. They're all going to be scrutinized by lots of different people, whether they're legislators, they're staff people, administrative people in the state, people who oppose or have some other interest in the bill. And so the bill, it's every likelihood that there will be changes made, there will be amendments proposed if the bill survives for very long in the legislature. And so you have to really think carefully up front, not only about what sort of structure you want the licensure program to have, how it's going to operate, what is feasible within the state, what are the fiscal considerations and political ones and so on, but also what aspects, if any, you're going to be willing to consider compromising on, and where you'll draw the line. In general, when you're engaged in the legislative process, it's going to be good to be seen as willing to consider amendments, particularly proposed amendments, reasonable ones. But I think you have to be prepared and think carefully ahead of time, what sorts of amendments you might be willing, compromises you might be willing to go along with, and, a point at which a proposed amendment would totally undermine your objective of getting a good licensure program in place. So it's just an unpredictable, political process. There is going to be opposition, and we have a lot of information about the sources of opposition and the arguments that are often made against behavior analyst licensure in general, or against specific provisions of a licensure model that we recommend. And so we can help the behavior analysis organization in a jurisdiction anticipate those problems, work to head them off, respond to them when they do arise. But there's just no guarantee. We've seen licensure bills get through in states where, at the beginning, if I were a betting person, which I'm not, I would not have bet that that licensure bill was going to survive, but it did. And we have some pretty good, licensure bills in some states with, not big numbers of behavior analysts, a couple where there wasn't even a behavior analysis organization in the state at the time a licensure bill was initiated. And then, all the way on the other end, we've had a couple of instances where licensure bills have been initiated by large, well-established behavior analysis organizations in the state that have long experience with public policy, that had good, very good professional lobbyists, and their bills failed or had to be pulled because of those pressures to modify the bill to the point that would have undermined the profession and put behavior analysts and consumers at risk.
So would those things that get modified, I have to imagine there's some sort of turf wars that come up, I suppose,
Absolutely.
with other probably well-funded or well-lobbied for, I don't know if that's the right term or not, but whether there's speech therapists or licensed clinical psychologists or what have you. And this is me guessing, but I've heard. Can you talk about the challenges of people kind of wanting to get in on the autism treatment train, or for lack of a better term?
Yeah, and I'll start by just cautioning everyone, as we often do with groups that are considering licensure, about linking it too much to autism treatment. A licensure law licenses folks to practice a profession, period, within the definition of that scope of practice for the profession and within each individual licensee's scope of training and competence. It doesn't, you're very rarely, it's extraordinarily rare to see, any kind of a licensure law that specifies a client population or a condition, with which those licensees work. So that actually is one of the challenges. When a licensure, a bill to license behavior analysts is initiated by behavior analysts or somebody else, very often, all the misconceptions that there are about behavior analysis already tend to come out,
of course,
in this process. And one of them is, that's just for treating autism. Those folks only work with people with autism. So we really have to counter that. We certainly want consumers, family members of people with autism, with other conditions who benefit from ABA services. They are absolutely essential allies. And so, you want their support and their help in the licensure process. But again, you have to be careful that you don't inadvertently reinforce this notion that ABA is only for treating autism.
Okay. Yeah. Good
So
point.
that's a big challenge. You're absolutely right about the turf wars. We always recommend trying to defuse those by, making it clear that behavior analysts, by and large, want to do behavior analysis. We don't want to do clinical psychology. That's not what we're trained to do. We don't want to do what other professionals do. We want to do behavior analysis. But there again, you're almost immediately up against the misconceptions that people have about behavior analysis, which range from, that's really simple. Everybody does that. We're all trained in behavior analysis. We hear this a lot.
Oh, I bet, yeah.
To, members of some groups saying, okay, those behavior analysts should be licensed, but we own that. Our profession owns behavior analysis, and so they should be licensed under our licensing program, our existing licensure board. And everything in between. People who are licensed in other professions saying behavior analysts ought to be licensed, but you know what? Even though my license is in an entirely separate profession, I'm trained in behavior analysis, so you should just give me a license in behavior analysis.
Because I went to a workshop once.
Yeah, I mean, there are various, bases on which people, make those claims. And my experience has been that often it's out of, honestly, just sort of naivete. The people don't know what the contemporary science and practice of behavior analysis is like. Many have information that's way outdated. They still use behavior modification, which I personally think is an outdated term and can be misleading.
Mm-hmm.
Or that's just part of psychology, and so why should they have, their own license? And you also alluded to, the fact that we are young and small in comparison to many other professions. And those other professions have large state and national professional organizations that have been heavily engaged in public policy work for many years. They have big budgets. They have lobbyists. And so, sometimes it's a David and Goliath sort of situation where you have, a small little behavior analysis organization and a state, and we're proposing to the state that they, license what, initially is going to be a pretty small pool of people. That can trigger concerns about cost, because for many licensing programs, it's expensive for the state to operate them. The model that we propose is more cost effective than many typical licensure programs, but we have to be able to convince bean counters and others of that. And then another common source of concern is that, again, people have this notion that, ABA is just kind of out there. All kinds of people are trained in it and are capable of doing it.
Hey, hopefully we are back and we've resolved our technological issue. I'm really sorry, guys. And I'm really sorry, Gina. Gina, you were on a roll there, and so I hope we didn't lose too much of that. I beg your indulgence to continue where you were left off.
Okay. Well, I was mentioning that there are other professions that have professional organizations that are large and active and, well-to-do and very experienced in the public policy arena, who not always, but often take some interest in a proposal to license behavior analysts. Sometimes they're supportive, and sometimes they're neutral, and sometimes they're pretty aggressive about taking control of the regulation of the practice of behavior analysis themselves. So again, it's just something for those who are considering licensure to think about, again, to take advantage of APBA's experience, resources. We've heard a lot of these arguments. We've got talking points, counter arguments, supporting evidence, just sort of tips and strategies for heading off problems. We certainly can't guarantee, to solve them. But, forewarned is forearmed, I think is the saying. And
sure,
so
yeah.
Better to have some information up front. I'm often saying that just when I think I've heard and seen it all when it comes to opposition to behavior analyst licensure laws or laws to fund behavior analysis services, something new comes up. But that's good because I can just kind of add that to the store of information that we have, and that enables us to better help, the next state or provincial behavior analysis organization that either decides to pursue licensure themselves or has to perhaps respond to a bill that somebody else filed that could be very bad for our profession.
So what is the most kind of egregious or outrageous thing you've seen if you had to select one or two in terms of opposition or things that come up that are unexpected or what have you? I was tempted to ask this question when you said you went, I thought I've seen it all, but things keep coming up and surprising me. So,
well, there's so many, it's hard to choose. There was in one state when a licensure bill was, I don't remember if this was a hearing before a committee or what the context was, but it's a state with a pretty conservative legislature, and they tend to be generally anti-regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And a comment was made apparently that this legislator couldn't really see the need to license behavior analysts. We could just have an Angie's list of behavior analysts, and that would be sufficient to protect consumers.
Well, that's a good one. Good example, that is, of something shocking, I guess. Not good as an obviously helpful commentary.
I just remembered, Matt, what I was starting to talk about when we thought you had the technical issue there is that when a behavior analyst licensure bill is proposed, a concern that often arises is that these lots and lots of people that are still out there who claim to be qualified to practice behavior analysis because they took a class or a workshop or they worked in a low-boss program once or something like that, but they do not have the credentials signifying they've met the standards set by our profession, Bcba certification. But there's often pressure to just go ahead and hand those folks a state-issued credential to call themselves a behavior analyst and allow them to practice behavior analysis, even though they, in many cases, don't have the education and the training that even approximates what is required, for example, to get APBA or Bcba certification. Very importantly, they have not passed a psychometrically legally validated professional exam in the subject matter, which is kind of the sine qua non, the defining characteristic of virtually all, legitimate and respected licensing programs. So there's this notion that if you set what we think are perfectly reasonable standards for licensing behavior analysts, that is, that they have to document training that meets the standards of the profession, and they have to pass the exam. So there are people that think those standards are too high, and that if those are the requirements for obtaining the state licensure, and then state licensure, it's going to determine who can practice and who can get paid from at least some sources for providing ABA services. The notion is that, well, there are all these other people out there that have been doing ABA for years who now are not going to be able to practice and are not going to be able to have their services reimbursed because they won't meet the licensing requirements. And so people will get, concerned or make the argument that that's going to restrict consumers' access to services and, drive up costs. And so they want, they see the solution being to, again, license all sorts of people on often, pretty thin sort of evidence that they have actual training and competence in behavior analysis. I think that's not a solution. Mm-hmm. It's a false solution. It's illusory. It ultimately puts consumers at risk. It certainly puts the profession at risk.
Have those fears ever been borne out? In other words, if a state passes a really well-written, strongly defined licensure law that restricts practice to those who are board certified and so forth, is there any basis to that concern that having such changes have restricted consumer access, driven up costs, and all those other things that you cited as lawmakers' potential concerns?
It's lawmakers and others that express them.
Sure.
And I can't say I have any hard data, but I think the question that always has to be asked when people raise this question about access is access to what? Services provided by whom, with what objectively documented training and qualifications. And I'll say that I certainly don't have any indication from the states that have adopted licensure laws that, there's been a huge deleterious impact. More and more funders are understandably asking for licensure. If you're a health insurance company and you've been mandated by another law, autism insurance law, to pay for these services that are called APBA, if you're a state that has a law that says that the health insurance companies and the Medicaid program or, other funders in your state have to provide these services, then, the state has an understandable interest in seeing that those services are provided by people who do meet, well-established, empirically supported standards. And, we're going to have a reasonable amount of oversight and, regulation of what they do. And so, the funders are often, if not the driving force, supportive of licensure, and licensure that, again, is based on a solid foundation, which, in our view is Bcba certification as the principal requirement for obtaining a state license. But it certainly has happened in several states. There are licensure laws on the books right now that allow people who don't meet those standards to be licensed by the state to practice behavior analysis.
Wow. What's the, obviously laws can be, I would imagine through the legislative process, those things can change, hopefully. I'm wondering what remedies are there for doing so. If you do have kind of a law that got through that has created the situation that you just described, has anyone changed those laws or anything like that, or is there
laws can certainly be amended, and virtually anyone who can get a legislator or few legislators to support a bill to amend an existing law, can get that bill filed. And so we've already seen some amendments that, in my opinion, have harmed the profession. No licensure law is perfect. No law is perfect.
Of course, yeah.
And so there certainly are some of our licensure laws, behavior analyst licensure laws, that could stand to be improved. And so, yes, to answer your question, behavior analysts can always, provided the resources and the wherewithal is there, they can propose to amend the law to try to strengthen it. But when you open your law up to amendment, it's going to open it up for others to propose amendments that you may then have to be opposing at the same time as, you're trying to get your desired amendment through, and it just, complicates things. There's, to a limited extent, there are some things that can be, I don't want to say fixed, but certainly strengthened through the rules and regulations process. So when a law is adopted, most licensure laws and other kinds of laws, let's stick with licensure laws, most of them are pretty bare bones. So they have some basic provisions for the requirements for obtaining a license. They will either establish a new behavior analyst licensing board, or say that the behavior analyst licensure program is going to be added to some existing licensure board or not. Some states there are really no boards. It's a state agency that administers the program. But the law says that the administrative agency or the licensing board or whatever the responsible state entity is authorized to develop rules or regulations to implement the statute. So it's in the rules and regulations that the details of things like the requirements for obtaining and maintaining a license, the operations of the licensing board, if it's a new one, the makeup and the operations of the board, the things like supervision of, let's say, assistant behavior analysts by behavior analysts, details of ethical and conduct standards, and complaints and investigations and all that. A lot of that is going to be spelled out in the rules and regs. Every state has, in my experience anyway, has a set of procedures by which rules and regulations are developed, have opportunities for public hearing or at least public comment on them, and then a mechanism by which they're approved. So it's not until once a licensure law is passed, those rules and regs have to be developed and approved before any license applications can be considered. So that takes a while.
Mm-hmm.
So there certainly are ways through the rules and regulations process that, in my experience, you can sort of beef up and supplement what's in the licensure law. But generally speaking, the rules can't go outside of what is in the statute. So if the statute says this is the requirement, the basic requirement for licensure, the rules can't substantively change that. They sort of operationalize it. They may flesh it out, but they can't go against it. The only way to change the statutory language is through amendment, again, going back to the legislature.
Okay, I see. With regard to a couple of other questions, and some of these questions are kind of related, so I want to transition to another question. This one was submitted by a listener that I kind of kept mainly intact. So this is, again, kind of a broad view question. Given your perspective of seeing lots of programs, traveling a lot, listening to different, I guess, stakeholders in the behavioral analytic world, what would you say the biggest challenge BCBA providers face in the coming years? Certainly we've talked about dealing with licensure, but also, we haven't talked much about billing, maintaining businesses, certainly, and I've had this conversation with other people, behavior analysis has gone from its infancy into its, adolescence, and where services used to be provided out of, nonprofits and school settings and large developmental centers and things like that. Now we have all these, clinics and other types of businesses. So the field is evolving. So, what do you see the challenges what do you see as the challenges for BCBAs over the next several years as the field evolves so quickly? While at the same time, all these regulations for funding and things like that, and with perhaps sometimes contradictory or confusing rules and things like that happening. How do you see things playing out? I guess, long story short.
Well, I think you certainly hit on one of the things that I think is crucial to determining whether we survive and thrive as a discipline and as a profession, and that is getting good licensure laws established in every jurisdiction. Although licensure is not a panacea, there's still many jurisdictions where that may not be the best way to go. But one way or the other, our profession is going to be regulated. It's inevitable. So we're going to have to come to grips with that. And it means we need to work hard to make sure that that regulation protects the integrity of our profession and our science and protects consumers. So I think those kinds of laws are going to be essential. Certainly, the laws and regulations that provide for, and other kinds of policies that provide for funding. Often when I talk about the importance of public policy work to behavior analysts, I say, it doesn't matter how smart you are, what great university you went to, how many pieces of paper you have that you can frame and hang on your wall. If there aren't laws in place that protect your right to practice and provide funding for you to do what you love doing. So certainly the laws that govern public and private health insurance funding, education services, rehab services, all the sources of funding for services for typical clients of ABA practitioners are a second area that's important. Tied in with that are policies having to do with health insurance billing. We are firmly in that realm now, mainly because of the advocacy of parents of kids with autism working to get health insurance coverage. And again, it's not perfect, but there are definitely some benefits, I think, for our long-term survival and growth, if we play it right, to be recognized as a healthcare profession. And we are increasingly, getting that recognition, but it's an ongoing process, and we have to be ever vigilant about that. The other piece, number of things I could zero in on that I think are really essential for our survival and health as a profession. But you won't be surprised to hear that one of them is training. It's training of the future practitioners and, the new practitioners that are out there. Not only in, the basic principles and procedures of behavior analysis, but in this whole area of being a professional, being a licensed profession and all that means. Again, an understanding, at least a basic one, of the kinds of rules, laws, and regulations that are going to affect your practice no matter, where you end up working. I think it means that practitioners are going to need, certainly in the area of autism intervention, and to my biased way of thinking, more training in just sort of basic critical thinking and scientific method and logic for, analyzing claims about interventions and discerning what evidence, if any, really backs up those claims, whether they're coming from within our own discipline or from other disciplines. So And then, for those who do see themselves, have ambitions to go run their own businesses, they're going to need to get those business repertoires someplace, or else they're going to need to know how to go out and find partners who have the repertoires in business and law and accounting and so on that are so essential if you're going to operate an ethical and successful practice.
I see. Yeah, lots of things to contend with.
Everybody's going to have to go to school for years and years. I mean, really, there's, again, I think this just comes with the, what I think of as our becoming a grown-up profession.
Sure.
As you alluded to, we're moving into, I think adolescence is about right. We're maybe in early adolescence. If you look at the course of development of other professions, that are older than we are, and where we are right now. But just part of it is certainly for those who go into practice, going to require learning about more than just how to do a functional behavior assessment, and how to build some repertoires and how to reduce some repertoires. It's going to entail several other sets of repertoires, I think, to be ultimately to be really successful and effective.
I see. You touched on one thing, and I'm tempted to delve into it. You talked about evaluating treatments, even some treatments that come in from our own field and things like that. That there's a whole series of questions that people have sent in to me wanting your thoughts on various early intervention curricula. Anyone who's on the ABA Facebook groups, they've probably seen you chime in here and there with a nice little friendly reminder of, what's the evidence for that? I'm paraphrasing, of course. So I see those kind of gentle prompts from time to time. With your Michigan Spartan logo. Yeah. States. Bob, pardon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't want to make that mistake. Yeah, I know. Those fighting words, right?
At school in Ann Arbor.
Anywho, but we've been going on here for quite a while and on good stuff on the licensure and regulation stuff. So what I'd like to do maybe is to perhaps tee up episode 2 with Gina Green and maybe just go all in on the clinical side and talk about all sorts of fun stuff about, how do we tell if these things that are coming down the pike are helpful or not? How do we critically evaluate them, especially in the context of, being told that again, just kind of, if even if they are coming from behavior analytic sources and things like that, how do we evaluate those things properly? And of course, I can't let a conversation. I'm going to have to let it pass this time. But of course, and I do want to bring up the topic of skepticism and in particular facilitated communication and things like that. So we can perhaps have that as the agenda for perhaps a conversation down the road, maybe a conversation at APBA. Maybe we could do a live podcast or something like that. Maybe have like the NPR quality of the hustle and bustle in the background or something like that. So,
well, I'm certainly happy to talk about those topics because they are kind of near and dear to my heart in a lot of ways. I think obviously extremely important to the success and survival of our profession. If we want to be respected, if we want to be on a par with other legitimate and respected professions, then those are the kinds of among the kinds of things that we all need to be thinking about and scrutinizing, claims and assertions of all kinds. I think particularly because obviously many of us work with populations that where all manner of interventions are being promoted and are being claimed to be, the greatest thing since sliced bread for, our clients' conditions. And so you're
Yes.
right. There are a whole lot of questions, a whole lot of there's a lot of territory to cover there, and I'm always glad to talk about that.
All right, cool. So let's end with this. And I know you've kind of sprinkled in lots of great advice for practitioners throughout this conversation. So at the risk of being repetitive, the last question before I let you go for this conversation would be, do you have any general advice for, say, a student of behavior analysis or a newly minted Bcba who, just passed the test and is, embarking on the job search or just taking their new job? What do you have any thoughts for that person?
I do. You probably won't be surprised that that's the case. Certainly for that brand new Bcba or the student, who aspires to that, I think it's really important to just accept the fact that what you've been exposed to in the course of obtaining that master's degree and that credential is really a tiny smidgen of all there is to know about our field. And it's really just a small fraction of the knowledge, skills, and abilities required to practice ABA at a high level. So I think, just being realistic about that, be proud, of course, that you've achieved that. You've gotten the degree and you've gotten that credential. I know that's difficult, but if you can think of that as a beginning and, a real sort of basic entry point for your real training, I would really recommend to any new, BCBA that they go get as much supervision and mentoring as they possibly can from the most well-trained, competent behavior analyst they can find. That, in many cases will mean you'll get that where you work, you hope. So you want to look for an employer that is going to provide you with good supervision and mentoring. I think you want to look at the track records of the folks with whom, who would be providing your supervision and mentoring, and find out, how experienced are they and what have they, actually done in the field. There are other ways to get more training and mentoring of a sort. There may be, peer review groups in the area where you're living and working, or some sort of peer support groups or journal reading groups. I think any and all of that is potentially good for your professional development. Certainly reading in the professional journals, and hopefully getting an opportunity to discuss what you read with people who are, more experienced and been around longer, more trained. I would really encourage people to seek out continuing education opportunities that afford, really high quality instruction. They're going to allow you to develop, to grow, to learn new things, not just to rehash what you already had in your coursework or practica. Mm-hmm. And, not just a continuing education event that's easily available, convenient, inexpensive, and easy.
Sure.
Go after the ones where, that provide solid information, and if possible, those opportunities to actually practice new skills. It's hard to get that part, actual skill training, and a lot of the CE events that are out there, particularly certainly the online stuff, even, some of the in-person workshops, depending on who's doing them and so on, are necessarily, because they're time limited in what they can convey. But I think if you look carefully at, again, who's providing that continuing education and what the nature of the material they're providing and the nature of the activities in that CE, then, can help you find ones that are going to give you that additional training. And then, if you have a chance, take classes and go on for further graduate training in the field. We certainly need people. Not everybody wants to get a doctorate. Not everybody necessarily is cut out for that. But, we certainly need, really high level practitioners, but we definitely need researchers, because without ongoing good research, the field will stagnate. All sides of the field will stagnate. So if you've got, the interest and the inclination, you might work for a while with that master's and that Bcba, and then pursue good doctoral training somewhere.
All right, cool. Well, thanks for ending with those words of wisdom to people who are out there in the trenches. People who are just getting started with their career, and people who are excited about behavior analysis and kind of applying their trade. So I really look forward to having a subsequent conversation about some of those things we didn't get to. And but until then, thanks so much for being on the Behavioral Observations podcast.
Well, thanks, Matt. I would love to do another session. Love talking about those topics. So let me know when you want to set that up. And thanks again. I really appreciate it. We have a great field, and it's really good that you're providing this mechanism, I guess, for people to think about it and obtain some additional information, maybe make some, albeit indirect, some contacts with folks they may not come in contact with otherwise. So thank you very much.
Oh, the pleasure's mine. And again, just to reiterate, folks, APBA home.net. And so you can check out all those things that Gina was talking about at the beginning of the show, and we'll certainly have that linked up in the show notes at behavioralobservations.com. Okay, folks, you just listened to session 21 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. Thanks so much for joining both Gina and me today. I really also want to thank you for bearing with us through some of those technological difficulties, and hope you got something out of the show in spite of those. So if you do enjoy the show, feel free to share this with like-minded behavioral folks, and whether that's in person or through social media or whatever. And any show notes, any references that we make today and so forth will be at behavioralobservations.com/session 21. So you can check it out there. And finally, be sure to support the Association for Professional Behavior Analysts. It is at apbahome.net. So that's our show today, and we'll see you in session 22. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.